Achtung, welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Murray and James Holland. And James, we are absolutely delighted to be joined by today's guest, aren't we?
Yeah, very special guest today. It is
quite the thing.
Quite the thing. It's Sir Max Hastings, who has dominated the narrative of the Second World War for the last, well, I mean, I don't want to embarrass you, Max, but probably kind of 40 years. And you've now got, rather excitingly, which just shows what a grandee you've become, because you now have a folio edition of All Hell Let Loose, which is your kind of magnum opus on your attempt to kind of tackle the entirety of the Second World War. You're a braver man than me. But for those who don't know, when a Folio Society book is a kind of like a special hardback, and it usually comes with a sleeve and a new introduction, and it's all very handsome, and it's a lovely thing to have on your bookshelf, and it's also a sign of of your grandiness, I think, if for want of a better phrase, Max.
I don't know about that. I don't know about that, James. But I'm always terribly flattered. They actually did one a few years ago, Bomber Command.
Oh, did they?
You're absolutely right. You were avoiding saying this, but it usually means you're probably dead if you get folios.
But I was just going to say,
of your books.
It smells of posterity, doesn't it, Folio?
But actually, what reminds one, and one of the extraordinary things, you guys are the sort of next generation behind me on the Second World War. But I published my first book on the Second World War, Bomber Command, in 1979, which is 40-something years ago. And I would never have guessed in those days that we would all be writing and selling, frankly, in enormous numbers, books about the conflict. And it is an extraordinary reflection of the fascination that it still commands with this huge worldwide audience. But the great thing is that we've moved on. I mean, I've just been broadcasting a tribute to Corelli Barnett, the historian who died very recently, and a Cambridge historian. And Bill Barnett, at whose feet I sat, sort of figuratively and almost literally, because I was a researcher on a BBC series in the 60s on which Bill was one of the scriptwriters. And Bill was one of the first iconoclastic historians.
Yes.
But I grew up in a very nationalistic age of history writing, that all our parents' generation had been in the Second World War, and they didn't want anybody raining on the parade. They didn't want anybody saying anything nasty. And my father sincerely believed not only that the British had won the Second World War, but that the Americans were just out there providing the chewing gum, and the Russians were somewhere in the east and missed doing God knows what. And so we had this picture that it was the Brits what done it. And when Bill Barnett was one of the first to say, well, maybe the British Army wasn't so wonderful, maybe Montgomery wasn't quite such a brilliant general as people said, Bill took a tremendous amount of flack from all over the place. But what I felt I learned from Bill is we've got to try and look at all history, but especially that of the Second World War, objectively. And that doesn't mean that you don't have to be an iconoclast, where you don't have to start saying, oh, well, there weren't any heroes and the British were rubbish and so on and so on. It's not like that. It's just a matter of trying to see some of the nuances. And I was always terribly impressed when I was young by my mother saying, she said, I'm absolutely sick of having to sit in this house and listen to your father and your great uncle and your cousin banging on about what a wonderful time they had on the war. She said the war was hell. She said it was pure misery. And she said, forget about the heroics. She said the separations and the privations and the blackout for all those years and so on. She said it was a miserable time, especially for women. And one of the things we all do now, you guys do, and I do, and Anthony Beaver does, and our generation of historians, where we understand things, that it ain't just all about the SAS. It ain't just all about the 7th Armored Division in the desert and all the great stuff. Of course, that's part of the story, but we've learned to see an awful lot of the rest of the story, particularly about women, particularly about the role of the British Empire and other empires in the Second World War, and the fact that not all of them regarded the triumph of Britain as a great thing if they remained subjects of the British Empire.
Well, I mean, I've very recently reread Nemesis, which I read when you first published it, and I guess that must be sort of 10 years ago now, something like that.
Oh, then 15 years, yeah.
15 years even. Well, yeah. I recently reread it, and it reminded me how, I mean, I always sort of think with your writing, and I think this comes through in All Hell Let Loose as well, is there is a sort of a simmering anger in your writing at the fate of the civilians, these poor people who just get caught up in this sort of typhoon of war. And I've always thought that comes across very, very clearly, your concern and your empathy with the civilian experience of war. And, you know, from a personal point of view, I've tackled most of the Italian campaign from Sicily to the last year of the war, but I've never done the bit in between. So I'm now doing, you know, from the invasion of southern Italy to the fall of Rome. And a big part of what I'm doing is looking at what happened to the poor old Italians who were caught up in this. And you're absolutely right. You know, when you look at accounts from the 1960s, for example, you'd be forgiven for thinking there weren't any Italian civilians in Italy at all while this was all raging.
And James, I'm sure you've already come across the stories of what the Moroccan troops.
Of course, yes. I was interviewed by someone who gang raped.
And this is stuff that nobody was told about in the old days. And it's not for a minute do any of us, do you or me or want to take away from the real heroism of the guys at the sharp end. But for every one soldier in uniform who was an active participant, there were hundreds who were just victims. And I mean, one of the things that I suppose I was middle-aged before I understood, across Europe, if you were a woman in the Second World War or in any war, it's the plight of a woman, you're completely at the mercy of a teenager with a gun, whether it's a German or a Russian or, dare I say it, a Brit or American. And if they decide to behave appallingly, and as the French colonial troop did behave appallingly in Italy, well, this has to be part of the story. And these are all the stuff that I'm also fascinated, and I've written a lot about this in All Hell Let Loose, by the issue of food. That I'm sure you're familiar with Lizzie Collingham's.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Which made a great impact on me about
The Taste of War, or whatever it was called.
The Taste of War, exactly.
Yeah.
And Lizzie Collingham, one was vaguely aware of this, but she inked in a hell of a lot of detail about the vital role of food, that thinking about food and being hungry was something, and of course it was so different from country to country, in that in Britain everybody moaned about the food and how dreary it was and how boring, but nobody starved.
Well, actually, I mean, Max, the interesting thing about food in this country and rationing in this country was it was incredibly pragmatic, the approach. The approach was, instead of allowing people to hoard and some people live off bread and dripping, we're going to make sure that everyone gets a balanced diet. Then you have less people off work with sickness. Then your production goes up. So it might have been a bit boring, but at least everyone got enough. I mean, no one had ever been fitter than, you know, from a waistline point of view, and everyone was fine.
Do you think that this perspective, though, comes from the fact that the land war never came to Britain? That our national experience of the war is necessarily, inevitably at an arm's length, because armies didn't come through here, and this is how our history was able to detach itself, and why our attitude to the war.
And did to the United States.
Yeah, well, exactly.
I think you're absolutely dead right, and I think in particular one thing that's very striking is there were a lot of jokes in Britain in the Second World War, jokes about the Germans especially, jokes about stormtroopers parachuting into the orchard and all this sort of stuff.
And Noel Coward.
You don't find any of that sort of stuff in France or Holland or Belgium or Yugoslavia.
That's a really
Greece,
interesting point.
The countries that were occupied. And one's always amused. There's a very witty, I've quoted it in All Hell Let Loose, very witty account of an invasion alert in a Wiltshire village by A.G. Street.
Yes, just down the road from me.
In 1940. And they all were laughing about the fact that having stood to all night and all the shepherds wondering if they could be allowed to go back to their flocks and so on. And the story, that particular chapter ended with one of these yokels saying to Arthur Street in his narrative, he said, them Germans never do what they say they're going to do, or something of that kind. And anyway, it was the whole point is that this passage about the invasion threat, it was all treated as a joke. And I think this is why you get so much more British and American humor about the war. So I think you've touched on something enormously important, the fact that we escaped occupation. And it goes, let me go beyond that. A few years ago, I was having dinner in Paris with a French intellectual. In England, you'd be laughed out of court if anybody called themselves intellectual, but in France, it's a respectable profession. And he was a man called Georges Liabeau, very bright guy. And his wife actually was the director of the Musée d'Orsay. And George said at dinner, he said, of course, the real point about you British is that you people expect to succeed in things. And he said, we, the French, we don't. We're accustomed to failure. And I said, well, it doesn't quite often seem like that to us. But he said, you think about history. He said, you think about history since the days of Napoleon. He said, most of our history is about losing things and about failing at things. And you people expect to succeed. Well, I hadn't thought about that before, but this is obviously important in the context of the Second World War, but it's also important in the context of history at large, that of what one's expectations are. And all those numbers, I mean, I can still always surprise an audience, and I've used a lot of statistics and all hell let loose. And you use them too. We all do it now. But if you ask an audience, even an intelligence audience, to guess the percentage of casualties in the Second World War that were British or American, and they mostly come up with figures like about 20 or 30%. They can hardly believe how tiny a fraction of a percent the British and American casualties were by comparison with Yugoslav losses or Greek losses or everybody else's.
Well, that's the passage in your book that when I had a refresher today that absolutely struck me this morning. 65% of all Allied military deaths are Soviet, 23% are China, Yugoslavia 3%, the USA and Britain 2% each, France and Poland 1% each. It's absolutely extraordinary.
It is. There is a caveat to that, though.
Yeah, well, of course.
The caveat is that Britain and America, because they were able to, because of their global reach and because of industrialisation and mechanisation and technology, were able to use steel, not flesh, to a very successful degree. And what that meant was, you have Second Army in Northwest Europe, of which only 14% are infantry, 8% are in tanks, and 43% are service corps. So you've got a very long tail. It's what I call big war. That's broadly a sensible approach and very efficient for the most part. The flip side of that is if you happen to be infantry, or if you happen to be in that 14% of a very small number anyway, and you happen to be in that 8% in the armour, your chances of getting through unscathed were worse than they were in 1914 to 1918. It's just that there's fewer of you. But of course, in the narrative, we focus on the kinetic bit, the fighting bit. So all our narrative is about jumping out of landing craft and, bursting through hedgerows and going across the Reichswald, and that's where so it skews those who are reading about it to think that, gosh, we must be so infantry heavy and armoured heavy, when actual fact the biggest proportion of troops in the army are driving trucks and service troops.
One of the most profound remarks I ever had made to me was made by my own daughter when she was a teenager, and she said, "Daddy, life's what you're used to." Now, that sounds a rather banal thing to say, but if you think about it, it's terribly important that all the people who during the Second World War were moaning in Britain about how lousy the food was, the whole idea, if you'd said to them, but in Leningrad, the defenders of Leningrad are eating each other, they're resorting into cannibalism, or that in China they're eating grass, this would have actually meant nothing to people in Britain because they didn't know the people in China. They didn't know the people in Leningrad. And so this business of how difficult it is, and the same goes with the infantry, that now they're all dead, we can have this discussion fairly freely. But when the veterans were alive, some of the things we're talking about now, some of the guys who were at the sharp end and suffered terrible casualties and went through Normandy and all the rest of it, they were outraged when they heard young whippersnappers like us, or relatively young whippersnappers as we were then, saying things like we're saying, because all they knew was they'd had one hell of a ghastly war, and that they'd seen an awful lot of their friends killed, and it's trying to, I think what we're all trying to do all the time, there are no great revelations. As soon as I see a book being published about the Second World War that says it's uncovered some stupendous revelation,
yes, you know,
I chuck it straight in the bin, because you know it's balls. What we are trying to do is to get a better perspective on it, is to see things in perspective. But part of this is to understand and to sympathize with all those people. And I mean, one of my stories, which made a huge impression on me, a woman called Edith Gabor, Hungarian woman, who I interviewed one day in New York, Queens. This is about 20-something years ago. And I had my wife with me because she'd been in New York with me. And Edith Gabor was a lovely little Hungarian woman who came up to about my waist. And she described for 4 hours to us her experiences in a succession of death counts. And all her family, except one brother, died in the counts. And after we'd finished, I'd arranged a cab to take us to Kennedy to get a plane back to London. And I stood on the sidewalk waiting for the cab, and it didn't come. And after about 20 minutes, I started jumping up and down and saying, look, if this goddamn cab doesn't come, we're going to miss the flight to London. And Edith Gabor came and stood beside us on the pavement, and she threw back her head and she said, she laughed, and she said, forget it. She said, it's not important. She said, it's not worth getting worked up about it. She said, when you've been to death camp, you get to see that missing an aeroplane really doesn't count for much.
She's got a very good point.
We were so humbled. I felt ashamed of myself then, because my behavior reflected this sort of 21st century. We expect things to go our way. We expect to be able to get the plane from Kennedy. We expect to be able to do this, that, and the other. And she reminded one of this critically important truth about perspective, about what that generation have been through, and in particular what other nations and other societies, and especially the Jews, have been through. And this is the message that all of us here, we're all, on the one hand, we're trying to understand ourselves, and second, we're trying to convey to new generations of readers and listeners.
Yeah,
well, I
absolutely.
You know, amen to that.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think it's very interesting, Max, because you know, there was this worry that the readership was an elderly readership of the Second World War, and that, you know, it would die out and no one would be interested. You know, what's been really interesting about doing this podcast is that actually our biggest age group is, I think, 34 to 38 or something, and the average age of listeners is 42. And I don't know how much you looked around when you were at We Have Ways Fest, but there were groups of 20-something friends and 30-something friends who'd come as a bunch of friends together, and they were very much younger people. And
they come to the subject with a different set of assumptions as well. They're not like me, who grew up in the 70s with The Great Escape on the television every bank holiday Monday, and the sort of tail end of that Tales of Glory thing. Even though the military in itself in the 70s was sort of not regarded with the prestige it then gained after the Falklands War, of course. Because there was that peculiar time of war films, but the army seen as sort of not glamorous at all. And I grew up. Those are the assumptions I grew up with. These youngsters are coming in, or when I say youngsters, these people in their 20s, they're coming in acknowledging the imperial element to all this that was very much put to one side in previous decades, and they're very much looking at it from that perspective. They want to know about the contribution of women. They want to know about the sort of the full effect of the war, rather than the sharp end stuff, which is really interesting because, you know, I very much come from the tanks are exciting generation, for want of a better way of putting it.
Well, I think one thing about the young's fascination with it is because they've never been exposed to danger, and or extreme danger, and they've never been exposed to extreme the discomfort in that way, that everybody tends to feel fascinated to ask themselves, how would I behave if I found myself in that situation? Right. And there was an advertisement, I'm sure you two know about this, in the First World War. The Germans placed an advertisement in American newspapers in about 1916 saying, Americans, if you are thinking of joining the First World War, well, they didn't call it the First World War, joining the war in Europe, then, and you want to have some idea what it's like, dig a hole in your garden, half fill it with water, live in it for a week or two with nothing to eat, and hire a maniac to fire machine guns at you. And then you may begin to have some inkling of what it's like. One of the things I found from my own experience with armies, we are all this morning, I hope, well fed and comfortable and warm enough and not wet, and our feet are okay and so on and so forth. But the lesson I learned from all the days I spent trooping around battlefields around the world was that almost all battles are, first of all, they're fought at night. They're fought when you're absolutely exhausted, when you're either roasting or you're half frozen to death, when you haven't had enough to eat, when you haven't had enough to drink. And because I suppose in that sense, I was never a proper soldier, but I did spend a bit of time with total lack of distinction with the Territorial Army Parachute Regiment attached to a regular battalion. And one did discover on exercises, I discovered first of all how I personally, at the age of 17, found it almost impossible to hack it. And secondly, you just learnt this lesson of what it felt like to be sleepwalking your way through everything you were doing. And again, in the Falklands, that one did get that sense at night sometimes. God, you know, when there were 16 hours of darkness in the Falklands. And I remember one night in particular on top of Mount Kent, how it was far too cold to sleep and you just shivered all night praying for the dawn. And all this, because it didn't go on that long, this was nothing compared with what the people at the sharp end went through in the Second World War. Nothing. And one would never pretend, none of the wars I've been to in my own lifetime could be compared. The Americans have got this idea in their head that Vietnam was the worst experience for the infantry soldier. It wasn't. It was nothing like as bad as Normandy. I mean, the scale of casualties and so on. But you learn just enough to understand just how hellish it is. And furthermore, although I said earlier that I think how important it is that our generation of writers and broadcasters is addressing all these issues of victims of women and so on, at the same time, one's always remembering one's respect, one's admiration for the heroes. And there were a lot of heroes. There were people, partly because they were able to overcome. They were no stronger or bigger or much older than I was in the days when I used to go to wars. And yet, because I've seen a bit of it, I understand what it took to be brave, because most people are not brave. And to be the guy who got out of the trench and kept advancing when everybody else stayed in the trench.
Well, you're absolutely right. It's, you know, it's those platoon sergeants, isn't it? It's the platoon commanders, the company commanders. You know, you're 23, you're Major Max Hastings in command of the Ayrshires or whatever, 2nd Battalion of the Ayrshires, whatever it might be. And you know, just think of the awesome responsibility on your shoulders. You know, you're absolutely knackered. You're basically barely out of home. Suddenly you're flung into this completely alien environment. As you say, it's pouring with rain, it's freezing cold, it's broilingly hot. I mean, if you look at the sort of Baedeker guide of 1933 or something for southern Italy and Sicily, it says whatever you do, don't travel in Sicily in July and August under any circumstances. then you know, of course, that's exactly what they do. They all pour in. You know, think about those tin helmets with kind of 38 degrees centigrade heat of sun kind of pounding down on you, and all the dust and the malaria, and you know, that's before anyone's actually fired a shot at you. And then you've got to command men. You've got to make decisions upon which the lives of your men depend. I mean, it's incomprehensible.
James, I want to tell you a little story, which is a stupid story about the difficulties people have today about understanding what real war is like at the sharp end. Batman. It's a word, I mean, an awful lot of people in the modern age don't even know what a batman is. A batman was the personal servant of an officer. And people fall about these days laughing at the idea that officers were considered entitled in the field in the Second World War to have their batman who would dig their slit trench and prepare their food and clean their kit and look after their weapons for them. And people say today, what are we thinking of? This terrible class divide that officers were given batmen. But actually, this was a completely rational, sensible thing to happen, because officers in the field are so up to their neck in the huge responsibilities of commanding a platoon or a company or a battalion. They don't have time to prepare their food or dig their trench. They are better employed going around their positions, sighting their machine guns, doing all the stuff that officers have to do. And batmen were absolutely critical. And I always remember dear old Bill Deeds, who was my predecessor at the Daily Telegraph, and who was an officer in the King's Royal Rifle Corps in Northwest Europe. And he said, he said, as a company commander in Northwest Europe, he said, I was sleepwalking my way through, but I had so much to do as an officer, as a company commander, that I jolly well needed somebody. If I was going to eat at all, somebody else had got to put the food in my hand. And nowadays, I've talked to modern senior army officers, and they say, of course, this is the logical. If we still live in the logical world, then senior commanders would still be allowed somebody to get their food ready. But of course, in the modern world in which we live, in Afghanistan or in Iraq or whatever, it's unthinkable socially to allow officers to have personal servants.
We need to take a quick break right now. We'll be back in a second. In depth. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. We're talking to Max Hastings. You met so many people over the years, assembling your books, researching your books, and coming to your conclusions about history. Why were people fighting? What made them get out of their slit trench and lead a charge? What were they fighting for?
Well, there's so much I could say. So much. One particular remark which has made a great impression on me: the great Australian war correspondent Alan Moorhead. He wrote a brilliant piece in 1942 after Churchill had visited 8th Army in North Africa. And Churchill had gone round, he wrote in a letter to Clementine at home, he said, I am trying to visit every unit in this great army and to tell them what glory may be theirs if they play their part in the coming offensive. Well, Alan Moorhead wrote, and I thought this was a brilliantly perceptive remark. He said what the Prime Minister, for all his genius, didn't understand was that most of these men doing the fighting, they weren't the least interested in winning Victoria Crosses or military medals or whatever. They wanted to be told, and Churchill was incapable of telling them, what sort of Britain they were going to come back to after the war. They yearned to be given some sort of objectives, to feel they were going back to a better world. Churchill's mind, Smuts said, the South African leader, very vividly, Smuts said, he said, Winston's mind has a stop in it at the end of the war. All Churchill could think of, which was at the heart of his genius as a war leader, was how to win the war. But he didn't think about what followed. And yet those men out there, they had to believe it was terribly important to them to risk their lives, to feel they were risking it for something better than they come from, because Britain in the 1930s, under a conservative government, had not been a very wonderful place, especially if you lived up north. As for what people fight for, it's always the same in every war. You fight because most people who are half-decent soldiers, they want to do their bit to avoid letting down their mates. And that's always the same. They don't think about the big issues. They don't think much about Winston Churchill. And they don't think, they knew nothing about Jews, of course, in those days, most people. They knew nothing about. So all they thought about was the unit and, if possible, to survive. That was their highest. So many soldiers wrote, very moving, both at the time and afterward, that the highest good, in fact, a Russian officer I've quoted, I think, in All Hell Let Loose, wonderful man, Yevgeny, I forget his surname, but wonderful man whom I interviewed. And of course, that was the great privilege. One was able to interview all these people 20, 30 years ago. And he said with Gennady, that was his first name, lovely man. But he said, you have to understand, he said, in those days, human life had absolutely no meaning at all. He said, all that mattered was to survive yourself. And he spoke with such passion. And of course, he was part of the Red Army, but his stories about what happened and his stories about, yes, that dreadful indifference to losses and so on that prevailed in the culture of the Red Army, which of course still prevails to this day. I'm afraid it's the Russian army has sometimes done brilliant things, but it is an unbelievably brutalized army. It's been the same in Chechnya. It's been the same in Afghanistan. It's always the same. And one of my, let's say, bolder assertions, which used to enrage British veterans when I said it when they were still alive, was that how we'd ever have won if it hadn't been for the Red Army taking most of the losses, I do not know, because somebody had to do an awful lot of dying in order to bring Hitler's empire to its knees. And it was the Russians who overwhelmingly did the bulk of the dying, not to mention the killing.
Yeah, well, they do most of the dying, but they don't do they don't absorb most of German resources. So I suppose that, it depends on which way you're coming at it. But I mean, one of the things I think is so your long career writing about the Second World War is that you've met wonderful people like that Russian soldier you've just met, and Hungarian Jews and so on. But you've also met, you were at a stage where some of the commanders were still alive, and
yeah.
I love the fact that you met Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris. I mean,
not half. Yeah.
What a thing! I mean, you're Alan R. link to Arthur Harris. So what was he like?
I spent hours with Harris.
And what did you think of him?
Back in. You've got to remember, when I wrote Bomber Command, Harris had never heard of me. All he knew was that I said, and I feel a bit ashamed when I admit this, I wrote him a letter saying I felt there was an awful lot about this Bomber Command story that hadn't been told, and would he see me? And I spent 4 or 5 hours with him, I suppose, and he was still very hale and hearty in those days. And of course, he spoke with great passion. But yeah, people do say enormously interesting things stick in your mind from all these years ago. That another senior airman whom I interviewed for Bomber Command was Rafe Cochrane, who commanded
yes, of course, 5 Group. Yep.
Bomber Command's 5 Group.
Yeah.
And I said, what sort of chap was Guy Gibson? And he thought for a moment. And then he said, he was the sort of young man who would have been head of the school in any public school. And I thought that was a very interesting remark, because heads of the school are very often not very popular or lovable people.
Well, and also in Guy Gibson's case, he absolutely wasn't. He was,
that's
he was
also true.
B stream and second 11, wasn't
he? On the other hand, where Cochrane was right, that in character, he was very much that type. Gibson.
Yes.
And all this, and I remember the shock I also got when I interviewed some humble air gunner who served under Gibson, who hated him, as many of them did. And he said he was sort of a little bugger who was always jumping out from behind a hut and telling you your buttons were undone. And so you get the real point, and I think this is very important. There are some historians whom I respect, notably including Hugh Strachan, who've no time at all for oral history. And I think they're wrong to dismiss it. Hugh is he's a brilliant academic historian, but he won't.
Absolutely.
Now, where I totally agree with Hugh, I don't think you can take as gospel any hard factual information about any war by veterans, especially because old men, we all get very confused in our memories. I mean, God, I find when I'm talking to fellow, people who are in the Falklands with me, and their memories of episodes are completely different from mine. And it's not that any of us are knowingly lying. It's just after the interval of 40 years, you forget stuff and you imagine stuff. And this is what happened.
And you've read stuff, and that starts to inform the memories.
But the point is, I would never, I think some historians are much too credulous. I won't name any names, but some historians who do books exclusively based on oral history, I think they allow themselves to believe things that old men and women say that one knows immediately from one's own knowledge are simply not true, but they write them down because these old people have said them.
Yep.
And I think this is idiotic. But on the other hand, once you get a priceless sense, you do get the sort of the scent and the feel of war from those veterans. And they say extraordinary things that, I remember once talking to Montgomery's chief of intelligence, a wonderful man, Bill Williams, who was an Oxford academic.
Amazing.
In uniform. And Bill Williams said to me, and this was about, 1983, I was interviewing him for a book on Overlord, book on Normandy. And he said, one of the extraordinary things about the war, he said, he said, we all hated doing it. He said, I was an Oxford academic who'd been shoved into uniform, and I was now masquerading as a brigadier. But he said, I only had one idea in my head: to get this whole ghastly thing over and get back to my proper life. But he said, sometimes when we were interviewing captured Germans, we sometimes got this sort of crazy feeling that they didn't mind doing this. And he said, in particular, he said, I remember interviewing a couple of captured German officers in Normandy. And I said to them, this is Bill Williams talking, he said, I said, well, why are you guys keeping going with this thing? That you've lost, it's all over, that this is all wasted motion, and a lot of people are dying for nothing, and so on and so forth. And he said, these two men, he said, they simply clicked their heels and they stood upright, and they said, because it is our duty, and as long as it is the Heimat, the homeland, we will keep the fight going for it, and so on and so forth. And Bill Williams said, it was so dispiriting, he said, talking to these guys and feeling they were prepared to keep this thing going to the bitter end, as of course they bloody did. And so all I'm really saying is, of course, from the sort of books that we've recorded, you've recorded some of this stuff, a lot of this stuff. If you keep going at this rate, you'll have outperformed me. But I've written down some of this stuff. But nonetheless, one cherishes. Whenever I sit down to write about the Second World War, indeed about any war, I'm remembering odd moments like that with people and the things they've said.
Yes, and they're very illuminating, aren't they?
Absolutely.
I mean, I think I've interviewed over 300 veterans, and they have been, obviously most predominantly British, but Germans. I've interviewed Maori. I've interviewed South Africans. I interviewed a Zulu once. And Germans, of course, and SS and all sorts. And I always found that there was a real value. But you could always tell the ones that weren't of any value very quickly, because they suddenly were telling you something that they've just read in a book. And I never really wanted them to tell me the story of the war. I wanted them to tell me about their own experience. And so I used to try and keep it so, tell me about your childhood and your parents, and warm them up and all that kind of stuff. And then I'd ask them about, what they thought of their uniforms and what they thought of their weaponry and all this sort of stuff. And you're not asking them to remember specific battles or specific dates or give an account of the Battle of Britain. You're asking them for little moments and little and emotions and emotional responses, which they can only get by remembering them. And I felt that was less likely to be distorted by the passage of time. And it's interesting because the book I'm doing now, I'm trying to make it about between 70 and 80% entirely from contemporary accounts, whether that be letters, diaries, or, reports or whatever. I do miss the opportunity to talk to people and ask them things which I can no longer ask them and I haven't got answers for because, they've all gone or they're too old to be able to provide those questions. And that's both a sadness and a frustration.
But another moment, there was a wonderful man whom I almost worshipped, because I'm sure you find the same. One used to fall in love with some of these veterans because they were so wonderful. And one of them I fell in love with was a guy called Andrew Wilson, who was a tank officer in Normandy, wrote a rather good
the flamethrower one.
Flamethrower, exactly.
Yeah. Brilliant book.
Andrew Wilson, who was superbly vivid witness, and he told wonderful, wonderful stories to me. But one of the things he said, which stuck in my mind, he said, in Normandy with my tank crew, I discovered a love between men, which is impossible in Anglo-Saxon society in peacetime. And one knew exactly what he meant. And of course, in those days, he wasn't thinking about gays or anything like that. He was just thinking about, and this thing, which is a very real force, and one should never mock. It's so easy to mock some of these things. In wars, people do discover a love between men, which has nothing whatever to do with sex or to do with homosexuality or anything else. And it's completely, and in fact, curiously
it's
enough,
intense camaraderie, isn't it? That's what we're talking
about. But it's a passion. And in fact, oddly enough, my dear friend Michael Hyatt, the historian, who was himself gay, and Michael talked to me very frankly about his own life, both as a gay and as a Coldstream Guards officer in Italy. And one of the things, Michael, I was fascinated by, he showed me a letter. He wrote a letter some years ago now because of course he was a very distinguished academic, and he wrote a letter to the Permanent Undersecretary at the Ministry of Defence saying that he was very cautious, speaking as both a gay and a veteran, about permitting open gayness anywhere near the forward areas, because he said nobody knew better than himself, with his extraordinary experience, that it was absolutely vital that comradeship was not sullied by any sexual element at all. And I greatly admired Michael for many reasons, but I admired him for writing such a letter in that, because he understood so much from his own experience. That it's a very interesting little sideline, isn't it?
Yeah, it absolutely is. I remember him showing me this letter he'd written to his parents. I think he was, if I remember rightly, he was wounded at Salerno, but he rejoined just after the fall of Rome, and they were in Tuscany, and they were approaching Florence. And in this letter, he says, we came across this little hamlet, this collection of farmhouses and buildings on a ridgeline, and in the distance you could see this village, maybe a mile or two away, and you could see the terracotta roofs. And beyond that was Impruneta, and then in the distance was Florence, white against the blue of the rising Apennines. And we all thought, gosh, we've got to get there, then we've got to get through those mountains again. And I remember kind of 65 years later, having that letter, going to that exact same spot and seeing the same view. And it was because the view was exactly the same that I know that I was in the right place. And it was the most fabulous connection to the past, to the present. It was really, really extraordinary. I mean, he was incredible. I mean, I know what a dear friend he was to you and to Anthony as well. And you were a literary executor and a neighbour, and he was one of your great sort of a friend and hero. But I've got to say, he was incredibly good to me as well. He could not have been more helpful when I was first doing my first book on history.
He was the real thing about another thing I think you would probably share my experience of this, that because wars are mostly fought by very young men, nowadays women as well, but nonetheless very young people of both sexes, that in the nature of being young, you tend not to be very reflective. And therefore, an enormous amount of the documentation and the memoirs and the diaries and so on of the Second World War, and indeed of everything, tell you an awful lot about what people did and where they went, but much less about what they thought. Yeah. Because the nature of being, it's the nature of being very young, you're just not very reflective. And therefore one is enormously grateful when you come across something that is really reflective and you think. Yes. And I was enormously, one of the most important influences on my first World War II book, Bomber Command, was that I tried to contact a pilot I'd heard about called Dennis Hornsey. And I managed to get hold of, I rang his home number, which I got from somebody. And the woman said, well, I'm afraid Dennis is dead. And I'm his widow, although they'd been divorced before he died. But she said, he did leave an unpublished memoir. And would you like to read it? And, well, of course, I was absolutely mesmerized. And this book, God, it had an effect on me, because remember, I was pretty young then when I read it. He'd entitled it, Here Today, Bomb Tomorrow. And it was a very long memoir detailing everything that had happened. Mm. And essentially, to put it in simple terms, he joined the RAF with romantic ideas and trained as a pilot and thought, gosh, this is going to be wonderful. And everything that happened to him after he got near an operational squadron was a nightmare. Because, first of all, he was terrified all the time. And secondly, he found, and he wrote about all this in excruciating detail. And secondly, he wasn't a very good pilot. And after his first couple of sorties, his crew demanded, I think he was flying a Whitley then, his crew demanded to be given another pilot because they said they had no confidence in flying the rest of their tour with this guy.
God.
And he went on, and he somehow staggered through. In the end, he was shot down over Holland, and amazingly, he evaded and he got back to England. And he was awarded a DFC, as you usually were, for a successful escape, and so on and so forth. But the point about this was, what I found mesmerizing about this manuscript was that he'd written in such detail about his own state of almost abject terror.
Yeah.
Every time, every day, he said those terrible, interminable hours before you took off. And by the same token, Jock Colville and his superlative war memoir. And Jock Colville had much against Churchill's wishes, having been served in Downing Street. Jock Colville became trained as a fighter pilot and did a few ops as a fighter pilot. But one day he was force landed at a Bomber Command airfield, and he said he was fantastically struck as a fighter pilot by the contrast between the gung-ho attitude prevailing in his own squadron among all these young pilots, and the incredibly serious, grave faces of those young men as they went out to the dispersals to take off.
Yeah.
And that too, and here was Jock Colville, who was there, and he just said he went home a very thoughtful man after seeing these Bomber Command crews, because he realized that, of course, their casualty rates were appalling. And he realized that there weren't that many gung-ho, but sure, you put a brave face on it again, when I wrote Operation Chastise about the Dam Busters raid, and I was so struck by the sister of one of the pilots, Hopgood, John Hopgood, and how on his last leave at home, he was so serious, and he wouldn't talk at all about what he was doing, because of course it was top secret, but he just played the piano for hours, which she said he did brilliantly well. But what she was struck by was his gravity and his seriousness and so on. And of course, Hopgood was killed on the Dam Busters.
Yes, he was,
But again, one looks back, and some of those idiotic memoirs that I read, perhaps you did too, when I was young, when I was a schoolboy, and I read hordes of these gung-ho memoirs of what fun it all was, and my father talking about what a wonderful time he'd had, and how he found the only way to deal with captured German officers was removing their jackboots, after which they were cut down. And all these stupid things and I suppose in a way, I've spent the whole of my professional life as a writer and student of the Second World War sort of growing up.
But tell me, Max, I mean, that memoir that you just mentioned, where the Whitley pilot, did you ever publish it? I mean,
No, he could. It was, and I don't think it. I think perhaps they could find a publisher for it now, but it was such a gloomy document. I don't.
I think it would get an audience now. I mean, particularly with a introduction by you.
Well, it was. I'll tell you what happened. That a while ago, that Hornsey published a. I begged his family when I gave them back the manuscript. And remember, in those days, there were no photocopiers, or not serious ones. So I hadn't photocopied the manuscript. And I begged them to give it to the Imperial War Museum. Well, recently I wrote an introduction for a new edition of a book he wrote about his escape. The Pilot Walked Home. And I was in touch with Hornsey's family. And I said, well, what happened to this manuscript? And there was some family disagreement.
Oh, God.
And there was some, and the daughter I was talking to, said she didn't know what had happened to the manuscript, but it had certainly never gone to the Imperial War Museum. And it's a tragedy if it didn't, because I thought it was a very important document. And one felt for this man. And in the end, he killed himself in about 1955. And he was somebody who never got over the experience of the war. And I think what had happened to him, he'd gone into it with such romantic illusions.
Yep.
And his wife worked on a fashion magazine. In fact, she knew my mother, who was then woman's editor of Picture Post. And Hornsey's wife, who knew all she'd had a glamour portrait done of Dennis with his fag drooping and his pilot's helmet on. And Dennis Hornsey in the picture looks so glamorous and the archetype of the bomber pilot.
Yeah.
And yet here is this guy who is a tragic figure. So the point is, it's not that one is saying everybody was like Dennis Hornsey. A lot of them displayed greater skill, greater courage, greater fortitude, all sorts of things. So it's not that they were all like Dennis Hornsey, but in order to see the whole picture, in order to put the Gibsons and the Mickey Martins and the Leonard Cheshires in perspective, you have to see a lot of the other guys who were bloody terrified.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Well, Max, this has been fascinating. I've just got to just press you on one point. You were saying that you spent 5 hours with Arthur Harris. I don't want you to cast judgment on him as a wartime leader, but just in your memory, I mean, what did you make of him? Did you find him genial? Did you find him gruff? Was he tricky or did you...
very, very gruff. He was terribly bitter man, for God's sake, because he felt that posterity had been so cruel to him, and he felt that he hadn't been recognised as the great war leader and bomber command as the great force in victory that he believed they had been. So there was enormous anger there, but he was a great raconteur, and he told me innumerable stories about his dealings with Churchill, about his doing, but there was enormous anger there, and I think it was the anger that came across most strongly. And of course, he was very bitter when my book on command was published, and I was very critical of it, that one of the Americans, R. Aker, came over to Britain specifically, and he gave a press conference at Heathrow and announced that he was urging Arthur Harris to sue me for my strictures on his command. But what I would say about Harris, which I think is very important, stupid people talk now about war crimes and so on. In wars of existential survival, you need absolute bastards like Bomber Harris. Bomber Harris, there's a great line of Churchill's, which I quoted, I think, in All Hell Letters, in which Churchill said of him after the war, he said, "A considerable commander," but there was a certain coarseness about him. And Churchill, I surmised in Bomber Command, and later became sure I was right, that although Churchill enormously respected Harris as a enormously serviceable blunt instrument, he didn't like him. Churchill liked gentlemen, like Alexander in Italy, and he liked people who behaved like proper blokes. And there was a vulgarity about Harris, expressed by that remark of his when he said that the British Army would never take tanks seriously until they could be taught to eat hay and shit. And that's a typical Harris remark. And he's so, but you need people like that. And in the same way, another Churchillian remark about Montgomery, when he said to Violet Bonham Carter, "Such a pity that our first commander, who appears capable of defeating the Germans on the battlefield, should be an unmitigated cad and bounder." And you need unmitigated cads and bound. Although the other thing I would say, if you want to be, in any war, including the Second World War, a really successful admiral or general, make damn sure that you take over when your side's starting to win, and you are stronger than the other side.
Absolutely.
Or if you're not, then do it in an out-of-way place where no one's watching, like Slim in Eritrea.
I've always believed that if Slim, whom I reckon was probably the greatest British commander of the Second World War, if he'd taken over the Desert Army in 1940 or 41, I think he would have failed as surely as the rest of them did. So Montgomery was a considerable professional. But the real thing is he took over when we were, and there's one of my last story for you, is of a Polish officer who was attending a staff college lecture in Haifa, because there was then a British staff college in Haifa, in about 1941. And a British general was lecturing them on the principles of victory in battle. And at the end, when he asked for questions, this Polish officer leapt to his feet and said, "Sir, you have left out the most important. Be stronger." And this is a great principle. You can be the greatest commander that ever was, but unless you're stronger, your chances of winning are not that wonderful.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, listen, good luck with the folio edition.
Yes.
And Max, thank you so much for coming on. You know, it'd be great to have you on another time. But
no, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It was great to see you at We Have Waste Fest. I know everyone really, really loved you, your talk then. And it's great to have you on the podcast today, so thank you.
No,
Thank you
thank
so
you
much
very
for
much
joining
for
us.
having me. All the very best, guys. Cheers.
Cheerio.
All
Thanks
right,
for listening,
all the best.
everybody. Bye-bye. See you soon.